thank you all for coming today for February's um, luncheon culture. Uh, Today, we're fortunate to have Dr. Richard Biffle. He's a professor of education at Thomas College. And I've had a chance to work with Dr. B a couple times, and it's really wonderful to have him come and talk with us today. He has a great deal of interest in research in STEAM, which is an opportunity for especially aspiring teachers and educators to learn more about that particular venture. He teaches a course entitled Introduction to STEAM. He's got a 40-year history in higher education, program administrator, faculty member, department chair, and is also a former elementary and middle school teacher and elementary school administrator. He's lived all over the world and traveled all over the world. And we're very happy to have him to talk with us today, in particular about weaving a tapestry of equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice. So thank you, Dr. B, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, and it's very wonderful to be part of your celebration and your conversation today. I'm going to share a few ideas related to a number of different topics. It is Black History Month. It is a celebration of so many different contributions of Black and African American people. I use Black because I'm a product of the 60s, so you all just need to know that up front. But again, I think it's heartfelt that you're taking the time to have these dialogues and discussions. Share a couple of other things too that are critically important. I'm also a professor of anthropology, and I teach archaeology and cultural anthropology and physical anthropology. So I have a rather eclectic background in terms of so many different things. I'm also currently the co-chair of the President's Task Force on Equity, Diversity, and Social Justice that we created last summer, actually, here at Thomas College to address issues associated with racial intolerance, systemic racism, racial injustice, racial inequity, and a whole litany of things relative to the pandemic. Do we live in extraordinary times? Yes, we do live in extraordinary times. We have so many things going on at the same time. But if you think about it, it's nothing new. These things have been going on historically. COVID has forced us to address and redress so many different things. But when we start talking about the inequities, be they socially, economically, politically, those things have been with us and haunted us for 200 or 300 years. And depending on which side you decide to sit on or the fence you decide to stand on, these are the things that are problematic in terms of what's facing us today. So my conversation today, and it is a conversation, is to really try to engage us in some of the things that I'm about, some of the things that we're doing, and some questions that we need to address and identify. So hopefully we'll have a dialogue. It's the start of a dialogue. And we can move forward. It is Black History Month, and I'm reminded that there are many people who don't even know a whole lot about Black History Month. So in terms of a basic conversation, it's also known as African American History Month. It's been recognized by governments from the United States and Canada, most recently observed in Ireland, the Netherlands, and the UK. And I find that interesting in terms of people are beginning to understand that diversity and inclusion is so critically important to many of these countries. But again, one of the things that I talk to my students about and my colleagues about is I'm also trying to get away from just celebrations of months, weeks, and days and incorporate this into 365-day proposition. But that requires a lot of work. That requires a lot of other things. 1926 is a benchmark year. The famous Black historian, writer Carter G. Woodson and the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History announced the second week of February as Negro History Week. The week was chosen because it coincided with Abraham Lincoln's birthday on February the 12th. and Frederick Douglass's birthday on February the 20th. So that's how it all started. And it dates back to Black communities had celebrated ideas associated with who we are and what we're about in the 19th century. Another curious kind of thing, and it is curious because I bring it up because people ask me where I'm from. I'm fourth generation Colorado. I can take my generational ancestry back to Colorado, but I can also take it to Tennessee because I've done some ancestral work in terms of the plantation that we came from in Tennessee, in a place called Culpeper County. Biffle's an unusual name. It's actually German. It's Buffel, Buffel. And I can trace my ancestry back to basically the Rhineland in Germany. And about 15 years ago was invited to a celebration of the Buffel family in Germany, in Kontwig, Germany. But for reasons known and unknown, I didn't go. And I quietly have always regretted that because that would have been a very interesting experience to show up in Kontwig, Germany and say, yeah, I'm your cousin from Colorado. How y'all doing? You know, but didn't do that. And so an opportunity missed, but I have been in contact with other people who have the last name Biffle. And it just goes to show the diversity, the migratory patterns that occurred, et cetera. And these are things that we don't talk about. Everybody thinks it's just fixated with the South. Well, certainly the Great Migration out of the South went west as well as it went north. But a lot of people don't talk about that. And when I discuss these things with my students, they're all kind of struck with the notion and idea of why don't we talk about these things? Why haven't we heard about these things? And I simply, I'm known for my authenticity and my realism when I address my classes. And I say, well, it's because someone didn't want you to know. Not finger pointing, just pointing to the fact that our history has a lot of work that has to be done. But it's not just our history. It's just the contributions of people who helped build this country. And we're still fighting those battles in 2021, as all of you are aware of. Last year pointed out to so many inequities and so many different things that were happening. But we have to look internally, I think, to figure out what is it that we need to do as individuals to educate ourselves and move forward. Malcolm X said something that was real interesting, and of course he's maligned for so many things, but brilliant in so many things too. And he just simply said, education is our passport to the future. For tomorrow belongs to the people who prepare for it today. That came from Malcolm X. And most people don't associate Malcolm X with those kinds of comments. But if you read certainly the autobiography of Malcolm X, and if you read other kinds of things about who he was, you would be more enlightened in terms of the man had great depth and breadth in terms of philosophy, ideology, commitment to change, etc. So we roll into the notion again of a few basic questions. And these are things that I propose to my students. These are things I propose to my colleagues. These are things I've proposed for quite some time. Whose history and for what purpose? A question. And I think one of the things that we're discovering is there's so much of our historical record in this country that we don't even talk about, particularly as it relates to people of color. Something that a colleague of mine said some long time ago was, do we have the will to educate all children and students? And these are sobering kinds of comments because sometimes it feels like we really don't have the will to educate all students. Third question is, what are the stories? Whose stories and for what purpose? I'm from the West, and Angel and I have had many conversations about being from the West and various places and spaces. I learned a lot about New England when I was growing up. And again, the stories of various kinds of ideas associated with New England were part of the curriculum and part of instruction. When I first came to Maine 10 years ago, and I remember the first classes I was teaching, I had students, curiously enough, that didn't know where certain places and spaces in the West were. I had students basically from Maine, who had never been out of Maine, who had never, left their communities. And that was pretty astonishing to me. And I guess as a world traveler, as somebody who's seen a lot of things, it was interesting. So more and more, I'm kind of that messenger. I'm kind of that ambassador for so many different places and spaces. And again, for every single one of my students, particularly white students, I was the first Black professor they'd ever seen. I was the first Black teacher they had ever seen. And I can't begin to tell you what that was like. Very, very interesting dialogues and discussions in that regard. A question that's come up because we're doing a really interesting initiative here called the 21-Day Racial Equity Challenge that comes out of Portland. Actually, the Portland Chamber ran that through the Chamber of Commerce down there, and we were able to get that. And a question that popped up last week, because we're in the 4th week, and it really relates to individuals. Are you colorblind or color brave? And what is the distinction between being colorblind and color brave? And we're having some very poignant discussions on our campus about that and many other things. Another question is, what ways can we redesign schooling, teaching, and learning in the curriculum for equity and inclusion discussion? We're still talking about whether or not this is a good idea. We're in the midst of a greater division than we've had, in my humble opinion, since the Civil War. How do we reconcile the kinds of things that are happening? How do we support teachers, administrators, people of goodwill, to have these kinds of discussions in classrooms, to have these kinds of discussions in lunch settings such as this? What is our role in terms of equity and inclusion and diversity? And the whole thing, the last question is, what happens when we shift our focus and confront unspoken truths? How do we shift our gaze? So some of this is, what we are talking about here at Thomas College. Thomas represents, so many different things, but again, the whole thing of change comes very, very hard in some places where the traditions, the beliefs, and the value systems run so deep. So a couple of things to share with you, and then hopefully we can get into a dialogue and an exchange. I've read a good book, and of course, the problem is I've read so many good books, I don't even know where to start. There are just so many good texts out there. Kende's book, An Anti-Racist, is really good. Discussions on race. Yes, if you haven't read Obama's book, you need to read it. Just so many different authors, so many different voices, and I'm really pleased. Stacey Abrams' book is really amazing in terms of her journey and other things. I would share with you another book that you need to put on your shelves is Coretta Scott King's Autobiography. Really powerful book. And you can learn a lot about where Martin Luther King basically got his ideas, because she was his editor for all his speeches. And many, many people don't know that. But at any rate, there's a book called 6 Signature Traits for Inclusive Leadership. Bernadette Dillon is the author of that book. So 6 signature traits of inclusive leadership. So as we talk about Black History Month, we're talking about different ways of looking at things. And the 6 notions that she comes up with: inclusive leadership is about commitment. It is about courage, cognizance of bias, curiosity, cultural intelligence, and collaboration. So when she puts these ideas together, what she's talking about is the notion of learning from the middle instead of top down, which is a very different kind of visual. We're used to top down kinds of structures. We're used to sometimes every now and then a bottom up. But she's talking about middle instead of top down, because in her belief system, that particular way of looking at things is more synergistic and more holistic in terms of its approach. So if you're looking for something in terms of leadership discussions, administrative discussions, recommend that. She talks a lot about global megatrends, knowledge, understanding, and application of life skills related to critical thinking, deep thinking, problem solving, pivoting, and other ways of knowing. And I think that as we talk about these things, many of us are profoundly aware that this is the 21st century, it's 2021. We have lived through many eras, decades, and ideas associated with this. But I still have, students that can't quite figure out what this is, what's going on, where is their place in space, what are they going to do? Because there aren't a lot of conversations related to knowledge and understanding of life skills related to critical thinking, problem solving. Another mega trend is asking questions. And again, as a candid kind of person, one of the great difficulties I have with many of my students is they don't know how to ask questions. They haven't necessarily learned the art of asking a question. And it's really tough to engage students in a conversation when you say, are there any questions? And nobody wants to say anything. We have to talk about the diversity of thinking, ideas, and talent. We have a lot of talented young people out there, but they're looking for direction, they're looking for mentorship, they're looking for conversation, they're looking for guidance. Another concept that pops up on the radar screen, according to Bernadette Dillon, we have to learn to innovate or die. And I thought that was a really profound statement, because she was talking about we have to deal with real issues, real scenarios, real ways of understanding things. We have to have a commitment to leadership, which means we have to stay on course. We have to have the courage to challenge the status quo. We have to understand how to be vulnerable while at the same time being humble. And another one that I thought was really quite interesting was being aware of your own bias. And she calls it dealing with meta bias that leads us to believe that everyone else has more bias than we do. And I think that that was really made me stop and pause and think. If you invest in being inclusive, things will change. But you have to know something about cultural intelligence or adaptability. And that is one of the areas that we are working on very much in our pre-service teaching program that we have here at Thomas and other things. We're trying to prepare our students for the realities of what's happening to them now. We're trying to put them in field placements where realities are happening now. COVID-19 has challenged us in a multiplicity of ways. And I don't have to tell you about remote learning and transitioning back and forth between hybrid. There's a whole new set of technological skills that have to be developed. Now, some people will argue and ask, okay, Dr. B, what does this have to do with Black History Month? Well, it has a lot to do with Black History Month because there's so many people of color that are not part of the process, not part of the conversation, and still are pretty much victimized by the education system. And now things, as a result of COVID, are identifying other things, and it's very curious. The kinds of pandemic things have been going on in communities of color for a long time. At a certain level, this is nothing new. Health inequities, other kinds of things, this is nothing new. Economic inequities, this is nothing new. Social inequities, this is nothing new. And so those are some of the challenges that we have, I think, in terms of what's going on. Another person that I think can give us some really important insights in terms of addressing these issues is James Banks. Some of you have heard of Dr. Banks, University of Washington Professor Emeritus, Introduction to Multicultural Education, and his approach to multicultural interdisciplinary curriculum reform, where he has developed his model in terms of transitioning through various ideas associated with change. Starts with contributions, focus on heroes, holidays, and discrete cultural elements. Then from there, you move to additive approaches. Content, concepts, themes, perspectives that are added without changing the curriculum or its structure. Then you get into transformation. Structure of the curriculum is challenged and changed to enable students to view concepts, issues, events, and themes from the perspective of diverse ethnic and cultural groups. And his highest approach is social action. Students make decisions on important social issues and take actions to help resolve them. Every class I teach, and I teach across the curriculum, I teach sociology classes, I teach psych classes, I teach anthropology classes, archaeology classes, education classes, STEAM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. I use these kinds of approaches to engage students into trying to understand how to solve and resolve problems. It was real interesting. Jason wanted me to share a certain context and construct about my own background and my own experience. And so I can use these approaches, contributions, additive, transformation, just very quickly to talk about, and social action, to talk about personal experiences. As I said, I've lived and traveled all over the world. At one point, I spoke 4 languages, my sister and I. My father was an officer in the United States Air Force. We left Colorado with the idea that my dad basically wanted us to see the world. And so we did. So the first overseas assignment, we went to Morocco. We lived in Morocco for 4 years. We didn't live on base, we lived off base. And that was intentional by my mother and my father, because they knew that we would probably never, ever get another experience like that. We traveled all over the Mediterranean, went to all of the great capitals of the Mediterranean. Really quite extraordinary in terms of that. But I guess I have to back up because, again, people who look like me, didn't have necessarily that experience. But who was my father and who was my mother? 4th generation. They were born and raised in Pueblo, Colorado. All my father ever wanted to do in his life until the end of his life was fly airplanes. My father was one of the original Tuskegee Airmen. My father was a fighter pilot in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. 30-year fighter pilot, 12 to 15,000 hours in various kinds of aircraft, 3 wars. When he got out of the Air Force, he was the first African American to fly for U.S. Customs. He was the first African American pilot to fly for DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency. And the curious thing about my father is he never talked about any of it. He lived by example. My father basically flew in a number of aircraft, and those of you old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, my father was one of the bomber pilots that was on alert 24 hours, 7 days a week during the Cuban Missile Crisis. In other words, what I'm saying is when my father left home, we were pretty much steeped in the tradition he wasn't coming back. That was the nature of his job. And again, he never really talked about that. But he was a pilot's pilot, and I've read his evaluations and other kinds of things in terms of who he was. When I first started teaching, I remember bringing that up in a class, and I remember a colleague coming to me and simply saying, "Why are you lying to your children?" And I was like, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, you're embellishing your father, talking about it." Then the next day I brought in some of the photographs and some of the pictures. It's the believability thing. When I first came to this college and I began to talk about things like that, people kind of looked at me and were like, yeah, right. Because they couldn't conceive of somebody who looked like me. They couldn't perceive that anybody who looked like me could have those kinds of backgrounds and experiences. We moved to Germany. We were in Germany for a year. We moved to Scotland. We were in Scotland for a year. My father came back because he had to be reassigned. And where did they want to send him? They wanted to send him to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. My parents had lived in the South. And he was bound and determined he was not going to take an assignment with his family in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina in 1962. No way. And the story goes is that he literally sat at the Pentagon for a year and demanded to go someplace different. So we moved back to Colorado. And then our next assignment was George Air Force Base, Victorville, California. And that was life-changing in terms of so many different things. But I bring all this up because there's so many layers of the discussion, so many stories that need to be told. I can talk about my grandfathers and my grandmothers. You know, these are things that we just don't talk about. And so trying to see yourself in certain things, in certain places and spaces is really interesting. When I first proposed STEAM, science, technology, engineering, art, and math, one student actually asked me, well, Dr. B, why do you have an interest in this? You don't, your degrees are in anthropology, your degrees are in ed administration, your degrees in political science. Where does the STEAM come in? Well, the original thing I wanted to be was an engineer. And I remember, you know, going through so many different challenges in terms of engineering because people just didn't believe somebody who looked like me could do those things. You've heard these stories, but I've lived these stories. I am the first and only African-American professor in the history of this college. This college is 127 years old. Much of my life, along with a number of other people, we're pioneers. We're the first of the first. So our stories, our backgrounds, our ideas, and other things are important. Yes, I'm a former elementary teacher, I'm a former middle school teacher, and I'm a former elementary school principal. I have people who look at me and they go like, how is that even possible? When I am out and about in community, and I'll just end on this story, the whole thing of believability. I get more questions sometimes about why am I here in Maine than anything else. I've had people actually tell me, why aren't you someplace else doing this? And it gets back into a thing that, you know, my mother instilled in us, and that's you're where you need to be and doing the job you need to do. What is Black History Month? It's about stories. It's about conversation. It's about dialogue. It's about dreams. It's about helping people fulfill their dreams. My mother was a concert pianist. My mother was an executive secretary. My mother spoke 6 languages. If not for World War II, she would have been probably one of the first African-American women to graduate from law school at the University of Denver. She never regretted the decision not finishing law, but she instilled in our family the notion and idea that we come from someplace and it was important that we fulfill our dreams. So that's kind of who I am, and that's kind of what I bring to the table today. It's not so much, you know, anything else, but what do you want to know? What kinds of things? How do you keep kids dreaming for the dream that they want to do? And the last thought just simply is we need to interrupt bias. We need to interrupt bias. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions because Jason knows I have to teach 3 classes this afternoon. And I'm just being up front. So I've delayed my 1 o'clock to 1:15, and they're delayed, they're elated. So what would you all like to talk about?
Dr. B, I wondered, you know, it's and you've kind of alluded to this a little bit, providing an experience for your students at Thomas, in what, you know, in for those of you that are not familiar, you know, with approved programs, one of the standards by which we evaluate or assess a program is their ability to provide diversity in whatever that might mean, and that definition might mean for their teacher candidates. And so obviously this is Maine, and there are advantages and disadvantages in Maine and in central Maine in particular. And I wondered if you could just briefly touch upon helping the candidates that are in the education program get that kind of experience.
I think part of it is you have to be intentional about what you teach and how you teach it. I teach a class experiencing diversity. Yes, part of the challenge is we do have diverse schools in central Maine, but they don't necessarily fit, the kinds of constructs and designs and definitions according to some people of diversity. We have free and reduced lunch programs. We have large numbers of students that are involved in that. We talk about that. We talk about rural poverty, but I make the connection between rural poverty and communities of color that have experienced rural poverty. We do a lot of research. We do a lot of basically readings. I have my students read a lot of different things. One of the great challenges of this generation, and I'll just say it, they're not readers. They don't read. And if they do read, it's really important that we construct ideas associated with what they need to be looking for relative to what they're reading. It's like disaggregating everything that they've learned and then trying to rebuild it. So there are those kinds of things, experiences that I have. I'll bring in people. They need to hear other voices other than Dr. B. I bring in a lot of different things. I have a lot of artifacts from around the world. I collect maps. We talk about these things. We talk about culture. We talk about things. Another thing, when I first moved to Maine, I thought it would be an excellent opportunity to talk about their own backgrounds, because many of them come from Franco backgrounds. They come from Irish backgrounds. They come from Welsh backgrounds, Scott backgrounds. You all know where I'm going with this. They don't know anything about those things. They have French last names and they know nothing about their ancestral roots. And they don't know what they don't know, and so trying to engage them is really tough. So what we're trying to do in the education program is give them a wealth of opportunities, even though some people say we don't have the opportunities to do things. Diversity is diversity, but I think sometimes you have to really dig deep in terms of how does that work? What does that work like? Yes, I have students that I'm first contact. I'm the first Black person they've ever met. And it takes a while, but every now and then they'll open up and they'll ask me questions. Well, I had one or two Black students that went to my school, but I never fully understood what they were going through. And I challenged them. I said, did you ever ask them? Or were they just incorporated in, whatever it was they were incorporated in relative to being part of the school community? So I think you have to be innovative. I think you have to be creative. I think, given a lot of things. We used to have a program where we take students down to New York City unbelievably for 48 hours. We ran that program for a couple of years. And I remember, being one of the faculty members. There were two of us that escorted 40 students down to New York City. We stayed in New Jersey. The next morning we woke up, we dropped them off in Times Square. We said, be back here at 6 o'clock tonight, and I don't want any excuses. Let them explore, let them get out and find. Did they get swallowed up? No. Did they get lost? No. I took a group of students up to Harlem. Now imagine taking a group of white students from Times Square up to Harlem, get off on 125th Street, and you're in the middle of Harlem. And it was an amazing time. It was an amazing walk. It was an amazing trip. They met amazing people from all parts of life. They were engaged in conversations. They were engaged in educational lessons. They were engaged in leadership. And they were also hustled. Welcome to the real world. How do you deal with that? I have a picture of a young man who had never been out of Maine. He was from, I can't remember where he was from, but he'd never been out of Maine. His mother called every day before we left, concerned that something was going to happen to him. I took a picture of him hailing a cab in New York City, and I said, this is your son. He's okay. He knows what he's doing. He was raised right. He even gave the cab driver a tip, which was really quite phenomenal. So I think, Jason, it's you do what you do and you do what you need to do, and you bring people in. You know, you walk toward it, you don't walk away from it. So it's kind of a curious concept. Other thoughts, comments, ideas, questions?
One question, Dr. B, that we've discussed this before when you mentioned you were the first contact, and I'm part of that group too, the first contact when I worked at Maine, of folks that they hadn't experienced either working with a Latino or an African American. How I guess my question is, how can that be an educational moment for other students who maybe don't want to admit that you were the first contact? How could you bring that into the classroom in a way that they learn to be able to be comfortable and to ask?
I think part of it, Angel, and of course you and I have had many conversations about this, but you have to give people the opportunity to talk about who they are, which means you have to develop levels of trust. You have to develop levels of understanding. And you have to tell your story. You have to talk your talk. And I think that's how I start things off. You know, I start off with creating a sense of community in my classes. We're all here. We're all part of an inclusionary experience. We have different backgrounds. We come from different places and spaces. I think the challenge sometimes is believability, because there's so much cynicism, there's so much sarcasm. You know, there's so much hiding within social media and social network. And when you have to talk with people face to face, that's a different reality. I tell them what it was like to be a civil rights worker, because that was my first job out of undergrad. I tell them what it was like to move from Berkeley, California, basically to New York City, to train, to live in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and go down south. I tell them what that was like. I share fears, I share vulnerabilities, and I share the fact that, you know, it took me a while to understand what my voice was and if I even had a voice. And how I used education, you know, to promote the kinds of things that I wanted to promote. But I hearken back to, you know, and I have all these quotes, as many of us do, but a quote that stays with me constantly is Eleanor Roosevelt's quote, "No one can make you feel inferior without your consent." And I share that, and we talk that, we pull that apart. What was she talking about? She was the first lady. FDR basically was her husband. It was a contentious time. How do we engage ourselves in those conversations? I bring other voices into the classroom. I talk about the civil rights movement with a multiplicity of people. One of the things that I'm doing now in terms of teaching a US history class, when we get to civil rights, we're devoting most of the conversation to the women of the civil rights movement, which is never brought up. It's never talked about. And there were many, many amazing people. Fannie Lou Hamer, I actually got to meet her before she died. And she was the great, you know, just organizer, politician out of Mississippi. So it's just trying to show students, sometimes you just have to take the step. You have to get out there. You have to go do something. And there's a lot of different ways you can do it. But sometimes if they hear it from somebody else, and, you know, it's not a sob story, you know, it's not a bleeding heart kind of thing, you know, don't feel sorry for me. There's nothing to feel sorry about. I've lived an extraordinary life. So I'm just giving something back and sharing what that is. But we have so many extraordinary moments that we pass up.
Emily Poland has a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so can you talk a little bit about the colorblind versus color brave? I've heard many people say, you know, well, I was raised colorblind, and it's used a lot, but can you just kind of elaborate on the color brave? What do you mean by that?
Well, the notion is that when we start talking about I'm colorblind, you have to, dig a little deeper. Like, what do you mean I'm colorblind? I remember I was part of a DSEG project in LA, and we worked at a school that was going through a lot of problems and happened to be a high school. And we were doing some interviews with teachers in terms of the curriculum and what was going on and why it was that students of color were not taking foreign language courses. And those students that did take foreign language courses were just running into all kinds of issues and problems and stereotypes and just all the things you couldn't imagine. And I remember interviewing a French teacher, and she was saying to me, well, the only thing I see who walk in these classes that I teach are French students. I don't see students of color. I don't see, other kinds of things. And so we started talking about the notion of colorblind. And she just simply said, I'm just colorblind. I don't see color. And I said, but at the same time, you've got 2 or 3 students of color and everybody else is white. You don't see that. And I said, you don't see the challenge and the problem sometimes of what happens when you're 1 of 1 or 2 of 30, or you don't understand the cultural implications of that. And that's when I first started engaging in the conversation. So in the 21-day diversity piece, there's a piece that's called Colorblind or Color Brave. And I think that the notion of color brave really gets into that idea of understanding cultural intelligence, cultural backgrounds. What do people bring to the table? I have an African student from the Democratic Republic of Congo in one of my courses. And we engaged in the conversation. We were talking about color blind versus color brave. And many students were just commenting that they just see her, just in terms of being another student, but they don't know anything about her. And then it came up in a presentation that she gave last week, where she really started talking about the notion of who she was. And one of the things she brought up is she speaks 6 languages. No one knew that. No one bothered to ask her about those things. And then after class, there were a number of students that were approaching her. And of course, it's the proverbial, they want to know more, they want to know more. And dare I say, I had to rescue her, because it was like, you opened up who you are, and now they want to know something more about you. And I said, that's color brave, because they're moving toward you and not moving away from you. They're acknowledging who you are. So in a kind of a simplified sense, that's the differentiation. You're moving towards something and not moving away from it. Color blindness tends to move away. I don't have to deal with it. I don't have to deal with you, but you have to deal with me. It gets into that one-way proposition. So it's a powerful discussion and concept.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
We got another question from Kathy.
Sure.
It was the thing that was occurring to me when you were speaking before. One of the pandemic opportunities that I've been able to experience is some of my professional courses that I've been doing are global now. And I'm taking a current one where there's somebody from India and a gentleman from Nigeria and a gentleman from Peru and a woman from Amsterdam. And not sure there's just a huge opportunity there. I guess I just wanted to go, hey, yeah, I think it's more accessible than people realize to really, my world is not very diverse otherwise, but during the pandemic, it has become actually incredibly diverse. And it's been a really interesting facet of the experience to now be able to learn how to communicate with everybody. It's been very different and very cool.
Yeah, Kathy, I think it's really powerful, the connectivity that we have that's global.
Yeah.
And I'm of that generation that all of this stuff didn't exist. I remember, when the Princess phone came out, and I talk about my students, and they go, "What's a Princess phone?"
Right.
And so when we start talking about connectivity, and I'm having them use their devices for some of the other reasons, in terms of reaching out and doing things. I teach underdeveloped countries.
There's phenomenal opportunity. I mean, just being language brave, you know, working in these, just understanding everybody, you know, and being able to be really honest and vulnerable about whether you can understand. I mean, these are, you know, sort of high level conversations. We need to be able to have technical conversations. And so it's really good.
Yeah, and it expands and it engages. And I think that's basically what we're trying to do. The challenge is, you know, that kind of brave, courageous step that students need to take to do those kinds of things. But I go back and hearken that you have to have brave and courageous teachers to help them understand how to do that. You have to have adults that are adults and not children.
Yeah, there's lots of opportunities, I think, to look for. And yes, but all those things are so true.
Yeah, I mean, just the whole notion of it's 2021, and yeah, I got all kinds of stories about what 1965 was like. And they look at you, and obviously they have no context. They have no construct, and even what they've heard has been a lot of rumor, misunderstandings, and other kinds of things in terms of that. But I applaud you in terms of reaching out and doing that lifelong learning piece in an engaging, informative way. I'm doing the same thing.
Yeah, it's I have
other thoughts, comments, questions.
Pamela's got a question.
I just wanted to I was wondering as you were speaking, and you touched on this a little bit, but in the classroom, you can sort of create a safe space and, you know, maybe go in depth with topics a little bit more. But we in the department are trying to engage with our colleagues right now. And I'm wondering if, you know, that presents some unique challenges for you in your life, and how that, because you speak very well about students, but, you know, there is this peer communication piece as well.
Well, I think one of the things when we put the task force together here, and Professor Judy Hanson-Childers is my co-conspirator, we intentionally were trying to reach out to faculty and staff to engage in some of these conversations. And it's been tough. I'm not going to say it's been simple. It's been very tough. Because again, it gets back into that whole thing of bias. You know, it gets back into drilling deep and going inside yourself. Vulnerability, you know, those kinds of things. You don't want to be identified. You don't want to be victimized. You know, you don't want to go through all the things that you see people go through. So I think what we're trying to do is take steps, and we're in the 5th month of rolling a number of things out. We've done a number of surveys. We've done a number of other things. We've done things that are anonymous. The 21-day diversity challenge has been really quite extraordinary. And whereas, you know, people, you know, they're doing 3 things a week, and then on Fridays we have a forum, and our forum is growing. And this is the 4th week we've done it, so tomorrow will be our 4th forum. And so it's creating the safe spaces, as you talk about, to have the conversation with faculty and staff. But this is happening all across the country. Colleges, universities, institutions, departments of education at the state level, local levels, are all trying to figure out how to do this. But the great challenge is just, again, people having the courage to step up and really talk about the kinds of things that are on their mind. It's tough when you're dealing, you know, and somebody once said to me, the hardest audience to deal with are educated people, because they already have all the answers. You know, and then I push back and I say, but education is lifelong. Learning is lifelong. It's not static. It's constantly evolving. It's constantly changing, if you want to be good at it. You know, I think being an administrator in an elementary school will challenge you 1,000 ways that you hadn't even thought of. But a lot of it is just simply giving people the courage to be creative, to be innovative, and do things. I've read pieces about teachers who really try to talk about various things that happened in 2020, Black Lives Matter movement, other kinds of things that need to be talked about. We can't just push and brush this stuff aside. This is who we are. And it's encouraging from what I've seen with a number of teachers that are taking those courageous steps relative to saying this is part of the curriculum. This is part of the conversation. This is part of assessment evaluation, because it's lifelong kinds of things. And they're being supported by courageous, innovative, and creative administrators who are being supported by courageous, innovative superintendents. It's not happening everywhere. I mean, the pushback that happened in Utah a couple of weeks ago when they said schools will have choice relative to whether they want to address Black History Month. You know, and I was like, well, that's mature. You know, I mean, it's like, isn't it curious how we do things and how we don't? But creating the safe space for conversation is so critical. Listened to a presentation yesterday, and they were talking about pandemic transitional interaction and how the pandemic has forced many people to open up in ways that they never thought they would open up. This whole concept of remote and virtual, this is very different. You know, this is a whole different level of communication. We're having to talk to our students about, you have to have these skills because you may be in a situation where you have to go remote. You've got to figure out how to do some things. So, but creating that safe space, it goes back to what I talked about, creating a sense of community. Because if you don't have a sense of community, then all bets are off. Because people are just going to sit there. And they're going to be checking people out and, you know, doing, you know, the kind of facial expressions and other things. But it's not a 30, 60, 120-day phenomenon. You know, this is long-term commitment. Pandemic is going to be with us, ladies and gentlemen, for a while. You know, immunization, shots, not. Systemic racism, intolerance, and all those things have been with us for 200, 300 years. We've got to, you know, take the covers off and begin to have the conversation. Anyone else?
I have a question.
Yeah.
With apologies to you and your 115 class.
No, that's okay.
But so in this work, I see a tension between building, which I hear from you, building spaces, building community, and dismantling, right? So like the systems, the institutions that I've worked with certain intentions for years now. What do you do with that tension? What's the work look like?
I think a lot of the work is you have to read the audience and gauge where they're at and what is the cause of their tension. You know, I think the big tension that I see more than anything else is fear. And it unravels itself in so many different ways. So part of what I do is I address it and redress it in terms of, you got to deal with the fear. You got to deal with the individual fear and the fear outside yourself. You've got to lead by example. You know, what is it that you're afraid of? You're afraid of being isolated. You're afraid of being victimized. In other words, it's all the negative kinds of things, but what are the positives? And I think that's the delicate dance, is you've got to figure out what the balance is. But it takes some time to get to the balancing act, because you've got to deal with the negativity. You know, I've got to deal with my family. I've got to deal with my peers. I've got to deal with people in my social set. You know, I've got to deal with the reaction that I'm going to get, you know, at the grocery store. You know, I mean, it's all these different kinds of things. I used to work with gangs in Los Angeles, and I ran a community center in West LA. And when you're talking about those things, gang warfare was a huge thing. The Crips and the Bloods were, you know, just destroying the community. And if you don't know anything about that, it's even hard to explain. But when you have 12-year-olds that are walking around with a notion and idea they're going to take out somebody else because they're wearing a different color, you know, that's deep. And so I was part of gang intervention task force where we had to bring these groups together. Was that easy? It took us a year to get those young people to even walk into the same room with each other. I mean, that's how deep the challenges and the thing. And what it boiled down to, it was just fear. It was fear of being isolated. It was a fear that many of these young men and young women didn't have families. The gang was their family. You know, the gun was their implement, you know, in terms of being recognized. That was their voice. So, you know, I take some of the same things that I learned in civil rights and some of the things I work with gang intervention, and I take those to other places and spaces. It's not confrontational. In the 60s, it was confrontational. We were very confrontational in the 60s. And we learned a lot about, sometimes there are different steps and methods and ways of doing things that are more productive than being confrontational. But you can't dodge the controversy. You can't dodge, you know, dealing with the issues as they are. You can't dodge bias, racism, discrimination. I think that's why Kendi's book, Anti-Racism, is such a powerful book, because he talks about it in terms of 360 degree rather than 180 degree. And that's really, really powerful.
Well, Dr. B, thank you for participating. We don't want to make sure you get to your 115 class. And I think everybody from what I see in the chat, a lot of great questions and a lot of great information. Jason will try to get that to you. But I want to thank you for participating, and also want to thank all the colleagues for taking time out on this Thursday in your lunch break to be here and to celebrate African American Month. It's like Dr. B said, it's something we should celebrate every day, but it's good to celebrate this month too, to be able to come together and have these discussions. So thank you very much for that. And for next month is going to be, we're going to celebrate International Women's Month. And Mary Herman, is she on the call? I didn't see her. Mary Herman is in charge of the panel. We're going to have a panel of distinguished women from across the state. And
I will be facilitating that.
Okay, that's right. Great, that's right. That's right. So we're going to have that next month at the same time, third Thursday. But again, Dr. B, thank you very much. Colleagues, thank you very much for participating.
Thank you, Doctor, for coming in.
Yeah, mahalo anui loa. That's Hawaiian, so thank you very much.
Shukran, since you speak Arabic, right?
Yeah, used to, long time ago.
You.
Beautiful. Take care of yourselves. Be safe.
Thank you.
Great. We'll see everybody. Bye-bye.